would be talking about holy orders this week, but I lied. No, I didn't mean to just lie at the time. I intended to do that, but when I was looking over what I needed to accomplish, I really needed to divide it into 2 weeks. So we'll do holy orders next week, and this week I'm going to go more over about a vocation. And I mean not just a vocation to the priesthood, but a vocation to the religious life as well, because it's the same. What they call discerning a vocation is the same for folks. So, what is a vocation? Vocation comes from the word vocare, which means to call. And with the A-T-I-O-N on the end means the act of. So it's the act of calling. And the person doing the calling is God. So God is calling someone to act in a particular way. And you have to remember that it is God who is calling. It's not something that we ourselves decide. It's God who wants this. Again, we always want to do God's will. And so it's not like a career that you choose. A vocation is not a career. A vocation is a calling. God picks you out from amongst all the other people and says, I want you to do something. So, it's going to be God's will, not ours is important. Unfortunately, we often choose our own will over God's, and that is why there are so few vocations, especially in this day and age. Long before God made you, in His mind, even before creation began, God already knew in His mind you. Remember, again with God, everything is now. You existed in God's mind even before creation. And all the world that He created was created because He had you and the rest of mankind in mind when He created it. And before you existed in your mother's womb, again, God knew what He wanted you to do. And He prepared you. He gave you certain gifts and talents to prepare you for that job. And hence, a vocation isn't a career that we pick out for ourselves according to our likes and dislikes. A lot of people who are called to the priesthood or religious life, that's not something they would have wanted to do, but God made it very apparent to them, this is what I want you to do, and because they love God, they did it. And again, sometimes it's something that we do want to do. So, fulfilling the vocation God has selected for us should be the important thing in our life. And again, it comes down to this. What is God's will? So how do you know you have a vocation? Well, the word call, you assume, well, God's going to speak to you. It's possible you may hear God's voice. It's unlikely and very improbable. You're not unlike, you might, like St. Paul, get knocked off the horse, and, but remember afterwards he was also blind for a long time. And so he figured out what God wanted him to do. He got his act together. Sometimes we turn away from God's call because we don't realize that He is calling us. Because it isn't usually an actual voice. So what is it? It's an appeal to your heart, not your ears. It's best described as a desire to serve God better than you're serving Him now. If you have the desire or the love to serve God better than you're serving Him now, you probably have a call or a vocation. That God calls the heart captive. Huh?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm croaky. Could you say that again, please?
A vocation is a desire to serve God more or better than you're serving Him now. It's just a desire or a feeling that we have. And don't get emotion and devotion mixed up. It's a vocation very seldom. It can, but it doesn't usually or have to involve a certain amount of emotion. It's an intelligent decision. It involves your heart and your mind, where you decide, I love God, I want to serve Him better than I'm serving Him now. In that, if you have that desire, you probably have a vocation. And again, I say probably, because there are ways you need to discern whether that's God's call. Again, because He hasn't spoken to you and said, hey, I want you. You know, He may do that, but don't expect it. So, and God calls different people in different ways because we're each very unique personality. And according to our own personality, He will appeal to us in a different way. Some people, well, we'll get to that later. So the calls are varied. Some just feel, I just have a slight feeling, well, I think I might like to do that. And other people, you know, it's an overpowering zeal. I really want to serve God better than I'm doing now. And some people, again, are hear it when they're very young. And others don't hear it till they're much older, maybe even past the age of going to the priesthood or religious life. And there are always exceptions. Most orders and seminaries have a cutoff date, but they know that there are exceptions, and they sometimes allow that. So it's sometimes it's very sudden. Sometimes it's a gradual thing. It builds up during your whole life until you reach that point. So again, it changes, again, with our personality. Some are very hesitant, and those people are the ones who see, they want to serve, and they want to do more, but they're afraid of the cost, the sacrifice, because it will take sacrifice. And those people, in some ways, when they actually do approach that vocation, they will be more aware of what they're doing because they're not on an emotional high. They're well aware that this is going to cost them something. So that's the first step. There are 3 steps to knowing whether you have a vocation. That's the first step. Just that desire, that inkling, that idea that maybe God wants me to serve Him better. The second step is, all right, so now you have the desire, you have that inkling, you thought. What's the next step? Well, it's natural that if God gives you the desire and God wants you to be a priest or to be a religious priest, He will also give you the necessary qualities that are required for that job. So, if He didn't give them to you, as much as you may want to be a priest, or as much as you may want to be a sister, or a brother, or a monk, if He didn't give you the qualities, He doesn't want you to be that. So what are the qualities? It's necessary, for example, the qualities are necessary qualities of mind, health, and character to live that kind of life. In other words, you have to have good mental health. You have to have good physical health. So again, sometimes exceptions are made. And that will be up to the individual community, whether they'll accept someone who is blind or someone who doesn't have 2 arms. For the priesthood, they would not accept you. Why? Because you have to have these to become a priest. If you're missing them, they will not accept you for the priesthood. I.H.M, one of the things that they did to him when they tortured him, he was already a priest, they cut off his thumbs. He had to get special permission from the Pope to say Mass after that, because you need your fingers to hold the host. And again, character, and we'll go into the qualities necessary for character. So, what they're not talking about here is education. You don't need a college degree. You don't need a medical degree. You don't even need a high school diploma. You don't even need to necessarily read and write. What a community will teach you what you need. If you come to the community not knowing how to read or write, and you need to read in order to say the divine office, they'll teach you how to read. These things they can give you, but they can't give you health, mental health, physical health, or the qualities, the personality qualities that you wish. But the other things they can give you. So that's not what's required, any kind of special education. They just want average intelligence. Average intelligence. Emotional stability. Maturity equal to your age. Now, when you go in, you will not be as mature as somebody like, let's say you're entering the priesthood. A young boy coming out of high school or just, about college age entering the priesthood will not have the same maturity that will be required as a priest. But they want to see enough maturity to your age that then they know that you will, as you go through the steps, you will advance in maturity. But if your maturity isn't equal to your age, again, they can't give that to you. They might say, come back in a few years, or go work in the world a little while and then come back. A lot of religious communities will do that. They especially if people from homeschool who have never been out into the world at all. Sometimes they don't have a certain amount of maturity, and that they will say, wait another year and come back. I know a girl who went to the Carmelites. Father Fabulous' sister wanted to go to the Carmelites. She has a twin, identical twins. And identical twins are joined in many ways. And then you would never see one without the other. Well, the one wants to go to the convent, but the other one doesn't. So they told the one that wants to go to the convent, the Carmelites told her, they said, you wait a year, but in that year you have to be separated from your sister, totally separated, in different parts of the world. So one went to Kentucky and one went to Florida to help Father Fabulous. So one went to the convent, went to Florida to help Father Fabulous. The other one went to Kentucky, so they would be separated from each other, because there's an emotional attachment that needs to be broken before you go into the convent. So physical well-being and a sense of humor. You have to have a sense of humor. There's no way you're going to get through the priesthood or religious life without having a sense of humor. You can't be a morbid, really melancholy sort of type of person. They're not good in that kind of life. You have to be able to look at the world and laugh at yourself. If you can't laugh at yourself, you have a problem. And you shouldn't be afraid to apply to an order or a seminary that teaches, even if you don't have the ability to teach. Because communities that teach or nurse also need people to clean and cook, so that those teachers and nurses can go out and teach and nurse. They don't have to spend the time cooking. They have more time freed up to do those other kinds of stuff. So don't be afraid to apply to any community that you're interested in, regardless of whether or not you think you might be able to do that kind of work. That, well, I came to the sight of blood, so I better not go to a nursing. No. They put you in the kitchen. They can put you cleaning or whatever. Don't worry about it. They will decide where you fit best. So a candidate herself is the only judge for the first step, whether or not you have the desire. But the best judge for the second step, whether you have the qualifications, is the superior of the community or the seminary that you want to join. So you go to them and you ask. I know my mother was interested in joining a religious life, and she went to an interview with the superior. And the superior asked her, Well, they had talked for a while, and the Superior got a really good idea about my mom's personality. She said, well, if I asked you to clean this rug, and you knew that there was a vacuum cleaner in the closet, high-power vacuum cleaner, but I asked you to do it with just a broom, to sweep it, to take it outside and beat it, which would you do? What would you do? She said, my mom said, I would use the vacuum cleaner because it does a much better job with. My mother, the Superior said to my mom, you do not have a vocation. That is no. You do what your superiors, you will have a problem with obedience. You do what your superior says, even if you think she's wrong. And she can be wrong. But her voice is the voice of God telling you what to do. And you accept it that way, regardless of what you think. So the superiors do the best job of what your qualifications are. So then you move to the third step. So you have the desire, you have the qualifications. What's the third step? To know definitively that you do have a vocation, you have to join. You have to try it. You have to go and try it. Every year you see boys going to the seminary. I had at least 5 boys from one of my 6th grade classes, and there were only 7 boys in that class, but 5 of them went to the seminary. Of those 5, 1, 2, 3. There was more than 5. There were 7. But there were 2 different classes. 5 from one class and 2 from another class. Of those 7, 3 are still in the seminary. 3 are still in the seminary. 1 left because of health reasons. He was told, come back when you get your health problems figured out. The military had no problems with his health, but the seminary did, so he's now in the military. Another one was told to come back when he was more mature. He was not mature enough. They spent 2 or 3 years in the seminary, and they said, no, you need to go out and come back again in a couple of years. You need to grow up a little bit more. And the others, I don't know why they were asked to leave, but again, the seminary or the religious life will not keep you if they find that you do not have a vocation. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have a vocation. That means you don't have a vocation to them. If it's a religious order, every religious order is different. And maybe you don't have a vocation to the Carmelites, but you might have a religious vocation to a more active community. Or maybe you don't have a religious vocation to the society seminary to be a priest, but maybe you do have a vocation to the monks out in Silver City. Maybe God wants you to be an monastic force. Maybe He doesn't want you to be a priest. Maybe He wants you to be a monk. And maybe later He wants you to be a monk who is a priest, because they do send their priests to be ordained. Some of them. They decide whether or not you have a vocation. If they think you do, then they send you to be ordained. So just because you're told to leave, look at the reasons what they tell you. If they tell you you don't have a vocation at all, fine, that's done. But if they say you don't have a vocation to us, that doesn't mean you don't have a vocation. That means try another order and see maybe that's where God wants you. God has a way of. You have to remember this. It's very hard for us to know God's will. It's not hard for religious to know God's will, because God's will is whatever your superior tells you. But for everybody else out there in the world, it's very hard to know your will. So, you have no problem knowing God's will, because God speaks to you through your mother and your father. But once you're no longer under your mother and your father, you're going to have problems knowing what God's will is. So how do you know what God's will is? How does your mom and dad know what's God's will? Your mom and dad know what's God's will because He directs them by opening some doors and closing others. He gives them ideas about what He might like, and if they try to do it and it falls through, or if there's roadblocks, then they get the idea, well, maybe God doesn't want this. That's the way he directs most of us that don't have superiors telling us what to do. So the superior tells you you don't have a vocation in our community. That's God speaking to you. But it doesn't mean that you don't have a vocation at all. Try another one. But if he closes the door for several communities, maybe now you should think, maybe I don't have a vocation. Or maybe, again, maybe you get sick and you're told to go home because of illness, and another community might not take you because of that illness. Again, God's telling you not to. I know two really good women who both went to religious life. One went to the Oasis of Spain, and one went to the Sisters of Barrowville Sisters. Both of them got sick, and they were sent home. One got better and was going to go back to religious life, got sick again. She said, okay, God does not want me to go to religious life. And the other one, she got well, but much later. But by then, she was too old to go back to religious life. So God's idea for them was to remain single. And the single life is a vocation in itself. It's very hard, actually, a very hard vocation. I think God wanted them to be victims. I told them that long before. But, so now, maybe they'll. Anyway, so you should never think that entering a religious community or a seminary is an irrevocable step. The door will always be open. You're not going to go in there and they're going to lock the door behind you. No. You can leave at any time. So I really suggest that you don't. You wait for the superior to tell you to go. Because the superior will tell you to go if they think you don't have a vocation. It is as important to a religious community to get rid of a person who doesn't have a vocation as to receive someone who does. Because someone who doesn't have a religious vocation can really mess up a community. And the superiors know that. They're the ones who will cause dissent and problems because they will not be living the religious life that they should live. So superiors will be glad to get rid of them. So if you don't have a vocation, your superiors will tell you to go. And you'll have plenty of time, a number of years, before you have to make that last irrevocable step where you take your final vow. And in the seminary, it takes a long time, 6 to 8 to 10 years, depending upon the order. I remember Cardinal Cushing of Boston was a friend of ours, and a sister went up there to see him one time, and he was telling her about a little Italian lady who had come to talk to him about her son who was interested in becoming a priest. And typical as Cardinal Cushing was, sit down with this little lady and answer all of her questions about, she said, about her son. So how long does it take to become a priest? Well, Cardinal said a diocesan priest, it takes 6 years. Now, some religious communities take 8 years. He said the Jesuits, it takes 10 years. He better become a Jesuit because he's a slow learner. So anyway, it takes a while, and in that time, they can tell you to go or you can leave. Again, if you decide to leave, you may be doing your will and not God's will. If they tell you to go, then you know you're doing God's will. And that's what I've told all the boys when they went. I said, wait, they'll tell you to go if you don't have a vocation, but don't choose on your own. There's a long period of testing. It's like a long engagement before marriage, but unlike marriage, you get to try the life first. When you reach that point of taking your vows, you should know. 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, you should know. And there will be trials in that period of time. Your superiors will make sure you have trials because they will be testing you. So when you do finally reach that end goal and you are ordained a priest or you take your final vow, you then know for sure that you do have a religious vocation. There should be no doubt in your mind at that point. Because there's no doubt in the mind of your superiors. So what are superiors looking for in their candidate? In order to be ordained a priest, a young man has to have firm and sturdy character. In fact, these requirements are pretty much for anybody, religious or priest as well. They have to have a firm and sturdy character. They have to have a certain steadfast and dependability or reliability. They must be trustworthy. A man who can be trusted to live as a priest lives. To fulfill his duties of holy orders according to common goodness isn't enough. In other words, he has to be holier than the norm. Now, that doesn't mean that he has to go in being a saint. Sainthood is a process that you go through your whole life. He just has to have the rudiments. The superiors will be looking for the foundations of virtue in him. Not to fully develop virtue, but the foundations that they can build on, that he can build on. And what they will also be looking for is that he doesn't have the contrary vices, that those vices don't exist in him. You know, is he really proud? Is he selfish? Is he whatever? They will be looking for that as well, because again, you don't want that. And it's very hard. Remember, a vice is a habit, and habits are hard to overcome. So, the virtues that they will be looking for are things like piety, or godliness, chastity, detachment from the world. The world ruins more vocations than anything else. They will be looking for detachment from the world. Zeal for souls. Obedience. Again, that's what my mom said. And learning. Not that he has learning, but is he capable of learning? Is he willing to accept correction? Superiors don't expect the candidates, as I say, to be saints, but they want to see these at least in their character, that they can be developed. So, what about the loss of vocation? What if you have one and you don't go? I.H.M says that there's no doubt that in every age a sufficient number of men are destined by God for the priesthood. God chooses a certain number of men out of every generation, and yet we have so few priests. So there's a problem here. God obviously is calling priests, but young men and same with religious life, young ladies are not answering. If this is true, and of course it has to be, then that there's not a priest, then what's the problem? Obviously, people are closing their ears to the invitation. The most frequent cause of a loss of a vocation is love of pleasure, especially the failure to develop a habit of self-sacrifice. I saw this over and over and over again with the girls I had in boarding school and the children I taught in school. They would ask me, why do so many the girls not go to religious life? They're so caught up in the materialistic world. They are so caught up in fashion and how they look, the makeup, the shopping, the friendship, whatever. The boys, they're so caught up in that materialism. And there is also not that habit of self-sacrifice. there was one family, and self-sacrifice is a character trait that's developed in the home. There was one family who they had 2 priests and a daughter in religion. How many kids do you have? I want to say 8 or 9. But they have 3 vocations there, 2 priests and a daughter in religion. How did they manage that? They taught their children self-sacrifice from a very early age. They were a very rich family, but to look at them, you wouldn't know that. They lived in a very modest home. The kids had just, nice clothes, clean clothes, but not fancy clothes. They didn't have everything that came out on the market. And they made sure that every single one of their children had to, once they left high school, or in some cases college, they had to give 1 year service to the church. The boys went to some of the missions to help with the missions. One went to Singapore. One went to Africa. The daughter went to. She had no idea about entering religious life until she went to Mexico to spend her year in Mexico. And she came back and decided she was going to become a nun. She spent a year helping other people, and she realized this is what I need to do. You need the self-sacrifice is an important part of it. In large families, you learn that more because you have to share. You have to take care of one another. So you see it more in large families than you see in small ones. And again, in this day and age where everything is tending towards small families, we're cutting off a lot of our vocations. So, to offset this, the people who don't follow a vocation can expect to have a life of regret. It's not a sin not to follow your vocation, but you will regret it. In your life, you will look back and say, I should have done that. You will regret it. And you can also expect more problems in your life because you're not doing what God wanted you to do. You're doing what you wanted to do. And the life God planned for you is not going to go the way you're not following His plan. So you're following your own plan. You can expect a lot of problems in your life. First of all, because you're going to have to make up to Him for rejecting Him. And God offered you a narrow but a straight way to get to heaven. You chose the wider road that twists and turns and it has lots of branches and is more confusing. You can get lost on that road. St. Vincent de Paul said that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to save your soul if you don't follow the state of life that God chose for you. It's not impossible, but it's going to be very difficult because you're doing it your way. 3 freedoms intervene in the salvation of the soul. There's 3 freedoms that enter your life to help you save your soul. The first freedom is the freedom that God grants us through His graces. And the second is the freedom of each soul that can accept or reject those graces. And the third freedom is that each of us is an instrument to help our neighbor. So if God is offering you a grace and you reject it, what about those souls, those neighbor souls that are no longer, that will not be influenced by you? Because you're not the priest. You're not the sister teaching the catechism. You're not the nursing sister taking care of them, getting them their last rites. What about all of those souls that you would have influenced? And now you won't. What will become of those souls who have been saved, who might have been saved because of you? Think of the terrible responsibility each vocation puts on you. A special work. God chose you for a special work, and you rejected it. The work won't get done. The evil of missing your vocation lies not in the fact that you didn't correspond with God's graces, but rather in refusing to help those souls that need your assistance. All of those souls, you will have to stand before Almighty God and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know. All these souls, you could have helped, but you didn't know. Well, that sends you to hell? No. Again, it's not a sin. But you will have regret. That is one of the reasons for the paltry number of religious vocations. God calls as many as He ever did. But the prevailing selfishness of this generation makes them heedless to God's will. They only want their own, regardless of the consequences. That's the evil of not following your vocation. The consequences that will affect your vocation. So next time is Easter, so we won't have catechism, but after Easter then we'll actually talk about Holy Word. And I know there's one thing on here where it talks about, it was a quote or something, it says life. You will have a chance to lie the life. It's live. Okay. I don't have a pen on me to shade this up. Wait a minute. I have a marker. I want to line that. Live. The other
crime of today is that the religious life is probably because it's been generations of people not answering the call. It's hidden. I don't know if I would have had a vocation because it was never presented.
I know. And that's not your fault.
Yeah.
I mean, if God had wanted you, He would have found a way for you to at least come up against that, other religions, like your sister did.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It wasn't hidden from her necessarily, but maybe that's the process, of going back, pulling the society back to what it should be.
Yeah.
Got to keep working.
Yeah.
Thank you, sister.
You're welcome.
It was nice having